The Crow tells the story of a violent home invasion that happens on the night before Halloween, where Detective Albrecht discovers a young woman named Shelley Webster on the brink of death at the scene and her rock band musician boyfriend, Eric Draven, dead on the street below after apparently taking a tumble out the window. As the Crow watches from a pole, a young girl named Sarah shows up as Shelley is being rushed to the hospital. But when Detective Albrecht tells her that her sister is gonna be okay, she informs him that Shelley's not her sister and that her and Eric are just her friends that take care of her, and tells him that she knows that she's probably going to die. And it turns out she was right, because 1 year later she's dropping off some flowers at Shelley and Eric's graves when all of a sudden the same crow from before shows up and starts pecking the crap out of Eric's tombstone. But Sarah doesn't really think much of it, and after saying see ya later to Shelley, Eric, and her new feathery friend, she skates off to the local hot dog stand, where she meets up with Detective Albrecht, who buys her a hot dog and has seemingly filled in for Shelley's role of looking out for Sarah over the past year. Meanwhile, around the corner, a professional douchebag named T-Bird and his gang of goons are having a grand old time trashing an arcade and decide to plant a bomb on their way out. And speaking of birds, back at the cemetery, the Crow is apparently working some feathery voodoo because it somehow manages to bring Eric back from the dead. So while our feathery friend is busy summoning zombies, across town, T-Bird and the Goon Squad make a not-so-smooth getaway right as the bomb at the arcade goes off, which pulls Albrecht away from his hot dog dinner to investigate. But he's not the only one having a lousy night, because after the Crow leads Eric out of the cemetery and down an alley to find some boots, he leads him back to his old apartment. But when he gets inside, everything he touches gives him flashbacks to what happened to him and Shelley, including his pet kitty, who apparently has just been hanging out in this empty crime scene for the last year. Through the flashbacks, it's revealed that T-Bird and his goons attacked Shelley in her apartment for reporting safety violations before Eric showed up and was promptly shot and chucked out the window. And after cutting his hands on the shards of the broken window, Eric realizes that he appears to now have superpowers that allow his injuries to heal almost instantly. Meanwhile, at the local bar, T-Bird and friends take turns swallowing bullets for some reason when one of the goons named Skank gets offended by another goon named Tintin insulting his bullet-drinking abilities, so they proceed to have a little Mexican standoff for a few seconds before getting over it as soon as more drinks arrive. Back at the apartment, after finding some old photos in a drawer of him and Shelley, Eric has some nicer flashbacks this time and decides to use some of Shelley's old makeup to paint his face up like a mask hanging on the mirror. A bit later, after finishing his dinner of bullets and booze, Tintin heads over to the local pawn shop owned by some dude named Gideon to try and pawn some stolen goods. After he leaves, the Crow spots him, which Eric is able to see through its beady bird eyes, so when it flies over to where Tintin's hanging out, Eric follows it by jumping across the rooftops until arriving at the alley where Tintin is, and then takes a leap of faith down to the street below, where they then tussle and scuffle a bit as Tintin tries to put his handy knife collection to good use, but it ends up backfiring on him when Eric ends up using his own knives to turn old Tintin into a human pincushion, where he's discovered a little while later by Albrecht, who tells his supervisor that it doesn't look like the usual gang stuff, but his supervisor doesn't really give a shit about Albrecht's opinion and is more interested in a picture of a crow that Eric drew on the wall in Tintin's blood. Across town, Sarah swings by the bar from before, where she finds her mother screwing around with one of T-Bird's goons named Funboy. So her mom takes a brief break from grinding on Funboy's joystick to give Sarah some money for food and then tells her to beat it. Meanwhile, Eric borrows Tintin's coat and proceeds to pay Gideon's pawn shop a visit to try and find the engagement ring that he gave to Shelley. After a bit of gentle persuasion, Gideon tells him where the rings are, and Eric thanks him by helping him redecorate the place while telling him that each ring represents a life that he helped destroy. So after dousing the place in gas and getting Gideon to tell him where to find the rest of Tintin's little friends, he dumps the rest of the rings down the barrel of a shotgun before taking a step outside and airmailing them back to Gideon, who ends up having to use a back door as a fire escape. As Eric's strolling away, Albrecht shows up and Eric asks him if he remembers him and Shelley, and Albrecht casually reminds him that they're both dead. Eric agrees, but informs him that they aren't the only ones that are dead and that T-Bird and the rest of his goons died the moment they touched Shelley. But when Albrecht looks away for a split second, Eric disappears into thin air. Later, T-Bird swings by a club and reports Tintin's untimely demise and Gideon's pawnshop bonfire back to his boss, a fancy-haired fella named Top Dollar, while his equally fancy-haired girlfriend Micah chillaxes on the table. Back across town, Sarah's leaving her mom's bar when she's almost turned into a pancake by a passing car, but is saved at the last second by Eric. As she goes across the street to get her skateboard, she complains that with all the rain, it's more like surfing than skating, and Eric tells her that it can't rain all the time, which she recognizes as sounding a bit familiar, but by the time she turns around, Eric has already disappeared. Meanwhile, Sarah's mother Darla apparently decided to join Funboy back at his funhouse above the bar for some after-hours fun time when the crow flies in through the window to crash the party, followed closely by Eric. But when Funboy pulls out a pistol and not so nicely asks him to leave, Eric pulls up a chair and offers up his hand for Funboy to use as target practice. But when he does, and the bullet hole heals up in a matter of seconds, he quickly realizes he's in over his head, so he keeps shooting Eric with no effect, so Darla runs into the bathroom to hide. Downstairs in the bar, Top Dollar's top dog, a big black guy named Grange, informs Gideon that Top Dollar wants to see him. Back upstairs, Eric eventually gets sick of being poked full of holes and makes Funboy accidentally shoot himself in the leg, which causes him to pass out from the pain, so Eric drags him into the tub in the bathroom to wake up a bit. And while Funboy's chilling in the shower, Eric turns his attention to Darla. And after using his zombie magic to somehow squeeze the heroin out of her arm, he reminds her that she has a daughter she should be taking care of. Realizing that she ain't exactly winning any awards for Mother of the Year, she tearfully grabs her stuff and leaves. But when Grange sees Darla come barreling down the stairs and out of the bar as fast as she can, he heads upstairs to investigate, where he finds that Eric has turned Funboy into another human pincushion and then looks over just in time to see him disappear out the window. Later that night, in Albrecht's apartment, Eric reappears, and after reminding him that he's still wearing his hat, he asks Albrecht to tell him what happened to him and Shelley a year ago. So Albrecht tells him to just read the police report if he wants all the grisly details, but Eric chooses the faster option and just decides to grope his face a bit, where he sees that Albrecht stayed with her for 30 hours in intensive care before she died, so after spazzing out a bit, Eric asks him why he never arrested anybody for it. But Albrecht tells him that everybody in the neighborhood was too afraid to talk, so the investigation ended up going nowhere. Eric takes a drag of Albrecht's cigarette before telling him that he shouldn't smoke, and Albrecht tells him that he's sorry about what happened to him and his girlfriend before gloomy Eric leaves, opting to use the front door this time instead of just disappearing into thin air. Meanwhile, across town at his little meeting with Top Dollar, Gideon tells him that Eric let him live so he could deliver a message to T-Bird and the rest of his goons that death is coming for them. But after he gets a bit too lippy for his own good, Top Dollar decides to stick a sword through his neck. Finally back at home, Sarah plays one of Eric's band's old records where in the lyrics to one of the songs he says that it can't rain all the time, just like the guy that saved her from being smushed by the car did earlier. Later, the crow spots T-Bird and Skank making a pit stop for some munchies, so while Skank's in the store, Eric appears in the backseat and tells T-Bird to give him a ride, which Skank notices from inside, so he comes running outside directly into the path of an oncoming car, which he then proceeds to borrow and goes chasing after T-Bird, whose lead foot ends up attracting some unwanted attention from the local 5-0. But that little problem is quickly solved when Skank finally manages to catch up to T-Bird and accidentally pulls out right in front of the cops that are chasing them. But unfortunately, Skank survives the crash and continues his pursuit on foot. After the chase, now parked down by the docks, Eric straps T-Bird to the car while he tries to explain that what happened with Shelley was just a result of her not going along with their tenant relocation program before coming to the horrified realization that Eric is actually Shelley's boyfriend back from the dead. And while he's trying to wrap his head around that concept, Eric proceeds to wrap his head with duct tape and then throws a grenade in the car before sending it speeding down the pier just in time for Skank to show up to enjoy the fireworks. The next morning, Sarah wakes up to find her mom whipping up some eggs in the kitchen and asks her what drug she took to turn into a real mom for once, but she tells Sarah that someone just knocked some sense into her. Down at the station, Albrecht gets hauled into his supervisor's office and grilled about what keeps happening to T-Bird and all his goons, but when his supervisor thinks that he's holding out on him, he suspends him for misconduct. Later, Sarah heads over to Eric and Shelley's apartment, where Eric is upstairs burning old photos of him and Shelley, but he disappears when he hears Sarah coming. Once inside, she finds it empty except for Shelley's cat, but notices the smoke from the fire and goes over and finds a half-burned photo of Eric. So she asks him to come out and tells him that she knew it was him the other night because she remembered the words from his song, but she gets no answer. So frustrated, she says that she thought he cared and then goes to leave, but as she heads for the door, Eric appears in the window and tells her that he does care. Across town, Skank goes to Top Dollar and tells him what Eric did to T-Bird, and while he's ranting like a lunatic, Grange tells Top Dollar that he went to check out Eric's grave, and when he got there it was empty, and that Eric's now killed 3 of the 4, and he appears to be working his way back to Skank. So Top Dollar tells Grange to keep an eye on him since they may end up needing him. That night, the Crow manages to track down Skank at the club, where upstairs, Top Dollar has gathered all his goons for their annual Devil's Night crime spree. But while Top Dollar is giving his little pre-crime spree pep talk, the Crow flies in and crashes the party just before Eric comes strolling out of the shadows and takes his seat at the table. He tells them that he just wants Skank, but Top Dollar says that he can't have him and proceeds to order his goons to kill Eric. So they proceed to turn him into Swiss cheese, but when they go to take a look, he's disappeared again until one of the goons gets dragged under the table and Eric comes out shooting. During the chaos, Top Dollar, Grange, and Micah manage to escape. After running out of bullets, he decides to use Top Dollar's sword collection to dispatch the rest of the goons until Skank is the only one left and chooses to finish him off by chucking him out the window the same way they threw him out the window 1 year earlier. But Skank happens to land on a cop car outside, which was part of a raid that had surrounded the club hoping to bust Top Dollar's crime ring. So Eric escapes onto the roof right as Albrecht shows up off duty and sees him, so he follows Eric in his car while he runs across the roofs as he's followed by a police helicopter. After jumping down to the street below, Albrecht pulls up and tells him to hop in, and they end up losing the rest of the cops before he stops the car for a second and Eric disappears again. Meanwhile, as Grange drives Top Dollar and Micah to safety, Micah realizes that Eric and the Crow are linked somehow, so Top Dollar decides that to destroy the man, he'll have to kill the Crow. Now all done with the zombie vigilante thing, Eric heads back to his grave where he finds Sarah sleeping in the cemetery next to Shelley's tombstone. She says that she was waiting for him since she didn't want him to leave without saying goodbye again, so after giving her the engagement ring that he once gave to Shelley, he tells her to go home. But as she's leaving the cemetery, Grange grabs her and drags her into the church where Top Dollar and Micah are now hiding out. The Crow sees Sarah calling for help as she's pulled into the church, so Eric heads over there to save her. But when the Crow flies in and lands, Grange pops up from a balcony and shoots it, but doesn't quite get the job done. So with his feathery friend now wounded, Top Dollar decides to come and check out how Eric's invincibility is holding up, and it turns out that bullets now hurt a lot more than they used to. So as Grange is about to finish off the Crow, Albrecht shows up with a pistol and a flare gun for some reason and starts shooting. So while everybody's trying to kill each other, Micah takes the opportunity to scoop up the wounded Crow and runs for cover. Meanwhile, Albrecht finds a random shotgun lying around and uses it to take out Grange and then goes and runs over to Eric to come up with a game plan as Top Dollar runs up the bell tower with Sarah, where Micah chooses to stay behind and try to hold them off with her feathery hostage. Back downstairs, Eric informs Albrecht that he's not feeling so great, so Albrecht decides to take the lead, which almost immediately backfires when he catches a bullet from Micah in the chest. So Eric goes on without him and comes face to face with Micah, who, while bragging about how the Crow was all the power he ever had and that now it's all hers, the Crow decides it's had enough of her shit and starts pecking her eyes out, causing her to take a tumble through the railing down to her death. So with that little problem out of the way, he heads up to the roof where Top Dollar is holding Sarah hostage and tells him to let her go, and he's all like, "If you say so," and proceeds to chuck her off the roof. But she manages to hold on, and while Eric's distracted, Top Dollar lands a cheap shot and pulls out a sword, so Eric rips off a piece of the church and they proceed to have a wet and wild rooftop duel. But when Eric gets distracted by Sarah screaming for help, Top Dollar takes the opportunity to stab him in the back. And while Eric's down for the count, he proceeds to tell him that it was actually him that gave the order to T-Bird to clear out his girlfriend's apartment. So right as he's about to finish Eric off once and for all, Eric decides to mush his face a bit and transfer all the pain Shelley felt during her 30 hours in the hospital over to him all at once and then lets him go to fall to his death. Eric then pulls Sarah to safety and together they head down to check on Albrecht, and when Eric gives him a smoke, he decides that if he lives, he's gonna finally quit smoking. So Eric then tells Sarah to stay with Albrecht until help arrives before disappearing again, where he reappears back in the cemetery and collapses in front of Shelley's tombstone, and as he lays there dying, she appears and gives him a smooch before they both return to the dead, now finally at peace.